Hi, welcome to my kitchen. I'm Joyce and it's time to cook. Today I would like to share with you a recipe for unleavened communion bread. Communion bread is something that has been made for generations in the homes of women of the church, and recipes are often passed down in those church cookbooks, which is where I found this recipe. I made this recipe early in the COVID lockdown because my husband and I have been worshiping now from our office via live stream for a few months now. I thought this is something that you might be able to use, so I want to share the recipe and also my technique for making this unleavened communion bread. The bread contains 3 items plus water. So it contains all-purpose flour, olive oil, salt, and some water. Let's begin by measuring flour. I'm going to use my scoop that I keep in my flour container and mix it up, so I just lighten it up a bit. Fill my cup to overflowing. And then I want to use a straight edge to level it off. One of the things that you can use is a dinner knife with a backside that's flat, or you can use a straight edge spatula held up like a knife blade, which is the tool that I'm going to use. I'm going to do a little chop so that if there are any air spaces down in my cup, those air spaces get filled. And then I'm simply going to level it off again with the blade up like it was a knife, so it doesn't pack the flour in. Put the flour in a small mixing bowl. Then I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of table salt. Use a spatula for mixing, or you can use a wooden spoon. Generally, I prefer the spatula, so I'm going to mix this just to get the salt all incorporated. I'm going to make a little well with my spatula to hold the oil and the water. You could also use the back of your hand and go down in and make a well. So I'm going to measure 3 tablespoons of olive oil. And I'm going to add 3 to 4 tablespoons of water. And that measure is not exact because sometimes your flour contains more moisture than other times. So this is 3 tablespoons. And then I'm going to add just about another teaspoon for now and see how that works. So I know we have a drier day here. Then I'm going to take my spatula and just simply mix that all together. And as you mix, you're looking for how well the flour is combining with the wet and coming together to make a ball. And I can see that it's looking just a little bit dry. So I'm going to add a little bit more water. I'm going to go with another teaspoon right now. Just kind of sprinkle that out over the mix and stir again. If it's still looking a little dry in the bottom, you've got some dry crumble in the bottom, that might indicate a little more water, which I think is going to be true. So another teaspoon, and that's going to bring me up to about 4 teaspoons of water today. Now another day, if it might be a humid day and the flour has been opened, then you might be able to get away with just maybe the 3 tablespoons of water. And I'm still working with a a little bit of dry looking dough. One of the things you can do is kind of pick up some and pinch it together and see if it's going to come together into a dough. But I'm going to go with another teaspoon. This takes a bit of patience to get the dough right, but you need to get it right before you get it out on your counter space or your board, whatever kind of surface you're working on, trying to bring it together to make the dough. And I think I'm almost there, just a tiny bit more. And this is a little trick you can try also. You can just moisten your hand a little bit with the water, and that will help get that dough coming together. Okay, this is looking good, coming together as a dough. I'm going to just put a little bit of flour on my countertop here, spread it out so that I have a nice base for my dough. And now what I'm going to do, just work it a little bit with my hands. Put it down on the countertop that is floured, and I'm going to do some kneading. And I'm using this part of my hand. So what I'm going to do is fold it over and push. If you make yeast bread, I'm using kind of the same technique. And I should be able to do this without adding very much flour to it. The reason I'm kneading this is because we want to develop some gluten. Get that gluten developing and stretching it out. Some recipes that I looked at when I was first trying this communion bread call for just mixing this dough up and then breaking it into little pieces, maybe making a little ball and flatten it out so it kind of looked like a little biscuit, and then putting that on a pan and baking it. What I see as the problem with that is that it has a very oily look, feel, and taste to it because you haven't developed the gluten. Now, if that's the tradition you follow, what you want to do, how you want to make yours, that's perfectly fine. My motto is to each his own, but I find this works well. And with the recipe that I'm following, as you will see later, it's rolled out and it's scored so that when it was served at church to the congregation, it could be broken off into little pieces. Some unleavened communion bread is made in a round. And in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, Moses gave instructions to the Israelite people about how they were to do their bread off, or grain offerings rather, and also about the kind of bread that they were to make to consecrate the priest. And so using it also for Passover, this recipe with just these ingredients have been passed on. And it specifically said that there should not be any yeast as a leavening agent. So you're going to knead this for about 5 minutes until you have a really nice dough consistency. I want to show you how nice and pliable the dough is now. It looks really smooth. And I have placed on my countertop a dish towel, and I have a piece of parchment paper. What I'm going to do is just sprinkle a little bit of flour on my piece of parchment paper, and I'm going to roll the dough right out onto the parchment paper. Just a tiny bit on top. I don't want to add a lot of flour into this. Actually, I'm going to flip my parchment over because it's wanting to curl up from that direction. So start again. Sometimes that happens. Spread it out lightly, just a little bit on top. And then I also want to put just a little bit of flour on my rolling pin. You see that? Now I'm going to go into center and push forward, center and come back, and I'm going to keep rolling like this, picking it up at the end. Sometimes when you're rolling, if you come out to the end and you don't raise your rolling pin up, the dough is going to stick and it's going to follow your rolling pin. So it's a good practice as you're rolling to pick it up at the end. What I want to do is roll this out so that it's about 1/8 of an inch thick. I'm going to go side to side doing the same thing. And I want to try to keep it fairly square. And if you don't want to be really particular about what your dough looks like when you roll it out, you don't have to worry so much about trying to roll it in a long rectangular shape so that the sides are squared up. And I'll show you when I get this rolled out what you can do to remedy that if you want it to be really nice and squared off on the edges. Now, we'll show you a little tip here. My paper is starting to get a little wrinkle in it underneath, and you can see that this dough is nice and pliable. So what I'm going to do is just pick it up, just a little more flour on the top, tiny bit, and then just to continue rolling. Again, we're looking for about 1/8 inch thickness. So this is going to be considered more like a cracker as far as the appearance when I'm finished with it. Another tip is just to pick it up and gently do a little stretch. Oops, and that wasn't gentle enough, and I was just about to say that you don't want to tear the dough. So I'm just going to pinch that part back together, pick it up, flip it back again. And you are able to pick the dough up and handle it if you have rolled it to a nice consistency. I finished rolling this out, and it's about 7 inches wide by about 10.5 inches long. So one of the little tips I want to tell you is you can use your ruler or straight edge, and this is a ruler that I have just for cooking, and you can just straighten those edges up just a wee bit. You can come down here and do the same thing here. The next step is to portion these out so that they're easy for serving. And what I'm going to use is a little tool called a dressmaker's tracing wheel. This came from my sewing supplies. You may not have this available to use, but this was suggested in the little recipe that I found in the cookbook. Lots of ladies used to do a lot of home sewing back in the day when they were responsible for making communion bread, as opposed to today where lots of churches purchase a commercial unleavened communion bread. So what I'm going to do is use the ruler as a guide, and I'm going to come to the edge, and I'm going to take my little tracing wheel, and I'm going to make just some little indentions in my dough. That makes it just a little bit easier to break the bread into little pieces. Another tool you could use would be to use a knife with a serrated edge. So I'll demonstrate that one on this next cut. So I'm just lining it up beside my previous cut and using that serrated edge. And this is actually a tomato knife, but the good thing about it is there is some little space from the edge of the knife blade that kind of makes the knife blade line up with the handle, and so you could typically get your fingers under there to hold the knife, or you could just hold it up like this to hold your knife. So now I'm going to just take my knife and I'm going to just do a little pressing down in my dough with this knife edge. Move that over. I'll continue with this one using this tool. Press, so forth. My ruler, it's actually at part of a yardstick that's been cut off to make it about 18 inches, which is a size that typically works well with measuring doughs, is about an inch wide. And it has a line down the center. And so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to kind of offset that, and I'm going to do a little cut in the middle so that my little pieces of bread are going to be about a ½ inch wide. My experience with communion bread is usually they are tiny little wafers or pieces of a cracker-like bread that are unleavened. You may be familiar with the matzo crackers. That's another example of a commercial product that can be used for communion. So I just keep making my scores in my bread. If you have a serrated bread knife, that would be something that might work well, or possibly a steak knife. Just some ideas for other tools that you could do this scoring with. And I probably, if I were making this to actually serve at church for my congregation, I probably would not use the edges where it doesn't quite square up. That's just part of my personality type. So I'm going to just take this little edge off. And then we're going to go, I'm going to start here at the bottom, and we're going to do the same thing down here at the bottom. And actually I'm going to just kind of square up this end. Oops. I'm going to go ahead and take that one off. Now I'm going to do them crosswise like this. So the width of the ruler again, and just a little scoring in the dough. So you can see that this small amount of dough, which was really just a cup of flour and a little bit of moisture, makes a very small size, but when you roll it out, you're actually going to have lots of servings of communion bread. There are ladies of the church, typically in the past again, and probably some continue the tradition that maybe every Saturday or Saturday night they were making communion bread for the next day for church. Now what I want to do is go and dock the center of each of these little squares, and I'm going to use a toothpick to dock it with. I'm going to break the tip off the toothpick just a tiny bit so I have a little bit more flat surface, and in each of these little squares I'm going to simply make a little indentation, and that's going to let the air escape as this dough bakes, and keep it from having places in the middle where it's puffed up. So you get a nice little flat cracker out of each. This is going to bake in a 350-degree oven for about 20 minutes. It does not need to brown. It's going to still be light in color when it's baked, but it's going to firm up a bit. It's going to be chewy. And the thing that I like about rolling it out flat and making a flat bread or a cracker type of bread is the fact that it doesn't have that really almost overpowering olive oil feel and taste and texture in your mouth. I'm going to bake this on a sheet pan. And another tip I can share with you about the sheet pan is, if you like, you can roll your dough right out on the bottom of the sheet pan. And the reason I say the bottom is, if you're trying to roll it out from inside, even with a smaller rolling pin, right now I'm using a commercial sized rolling pin, but even if you have a traditional sized rolling pin, you're not going to be able to get it down into the pan to get it rolled. So you can use this side for baking it on. So I'm going to simply pick this up now, transfer it to my baking pan, put it in the oven for about 20 minutes. I always set my timer for 5 minutes less than the recipe calls for because there is a variation in heat inside of an oven, and so I want to check it. And hopefully you can see those little dots in the center of each one and the little lines where I've scored it. So I'll be back with you when this comes out of the oven. I indicated that I would tell you when the bread was finished how many pieces of bread were on that little sheet. There were 11 rows, and there were by 17 rows, and so that made a total of 187 little pieces of unleavened communion bread. I have this on a communion tray that we use here at home. I'd like to share a little story about this communion set. This came from a church that was no longer in use, which was about a mile from the farm where my husband and his family grew up. He attended, along with his siblings and his mom, this little church. And when it was no longer used for worship services, my husband and his sister purchased the church so that they could be caretakers. This communion set was inside the building when they bought it. He and I are privileged to be caretakers of this set. We're not sure the age. We know that the church was close to 100 years old. And inside the tray here, the little cups are actually made of glass. Most communion trays today use plastic disposable ones, but these are glass. And this is just a nice thing for us to be able to do, to keep this going. And my husband and his sister were honored to be able to care for that church. I want to thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I hope I've shared some tips that will help you if you would like to make unleavened communion bread. And I hope also that it's something that you will pass on to someone younger so that the tradition can continue. Thank you, and join me again here in the kitchen at It's Time to Cook.